Welcome back, biologists. We're now into lecture number 19 on ecosystems. This is the follow-up to our last lecture on ecology. And this lecture we're going to divide into two sections. So this first section we're now going to begin is going to be all about changes in ecosystems and what helps maintain that ecosystem. Um, Ecological succession is going to be the first thing that we're going to cover. Ecological succession is really community change over time, and there are two main models for how ecosystems can change over time. We have primary succession and also secondary succession. Primary succession is what happens when you start out with brand new virgin land, land that has never been lived on before. You could think of, for example, a volcanic explosion that spills forth a whole bunch of lava. The land that is created by that lava starts out not having any life on it at all. So that's primary succession, is the course of events by which organisms begin to live on previously virgin land. Secondary succession is what happens when a mature ecosystem basically collapses, for example, after a tsunami or after a fire, for example. But most things are wiped out, but not everything. The, uh, the ingredients that are required to have that system recover are still already there. And we're going to compare and contrast between these two here in just a second here. But secondary succession usually follows some sort of a disturbance, returning it to an earlier natural state. So in the image here that you're looking at, primary succession, uh, this green ribbon here, takes us all the way back to bare rock. So again, you can think of a volcanic eruption spilling forth lava. When you have bare rock, there's nothing growing on it. It takes the emergence of lichens and mosses to begin to break down that rock into smaller bits and start adding organic content to it so that the next group of organisms, the grasses, can start coming in and utilizing it. They start photosynthesizing, adding even more nutrients to the soil, and this then becomes suitable for low shrubs to begin. Once those low shrubs start taking over, they start adding even more complexity to the soil and encouraging other animals to start coming in. Then it becomes suitable for high shrubs, which then give way to shrub-like trees, which gives way to low-lying trees, which eventually give way to high trees. But it is not possible for these high trees to exist unless the conditions for them are created by the low trees, and vice versa, all the way down to the lowest levels here. In secondary succession, we're not starting out with the bare rock. Essentially what we've done is we've taken this forest at any level here, whether it's in the high shrub level or the low tree or high tree level, and let's, for example, say, set a fire to this forest. All that stuff gets burned down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the soil underneath has had all the nutrients removed. They're still there, right? There's still lots of nutrients in that soil. And so instead of having this forest recover all the way from the bare rock phase, they're recovering from the grass and lowland shrub phase right over here. So that's secondary succession. Let me give you another couple of examples and pictures here of primary succession. This is a community basically developing on previously unoccupied land. And the organisms that come in and do that initial breakdown, we refer to them as pioneer species. Pioneer species are those things that come in and actually begin colonizing. They're usually things like bacteria, microbes, and lichens. And this is in contrast, the pioneer species here, which are early in succession, are in contrast to climax communities. Climax communities are those that are usually on the other end of the spectrum in succession. These are the ones that emerge late in the process, and they actually end up resisting further change in the system. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. So again, here's an example of primary succession where you have a lava field and the earliest microbes and lichens come in, begin to break down that rock, and in come the ferns actually. The ferns are next to begin to take root in some of that bare soil, which still isn't very nutrient rich yet. but they start continuing to break down the rock even further and begin to add organic content into that soil. So yeah, here is a lava flow creating conditions for primary succession in some future event. Then there's secondary succession. This is where you have an existing community that is disrupted by some sort of a disturbance, and it then begins to recover and return to that high degree of diversity. This picture here is actually from a recent fire in Los Angeles County, where you'll notice a fire went through, but it wiped out a lot of underbrush, and it may even have destroyed some younger trees. But the older trees, even though they are scorched here, they are not dead necessarily, and the organic content of the soil is still remaining, and thus plants can return from this much more quickly. But ultimately, if the system has not been disturbed for very long and it's allowed to persist and eventually work its way towards that high degree of complexity, then you end up with a climax community. So old growth forests are a really good example of climax communities. Very large trees, and in being so large, they actually end up shading the undergrowth, preventing other trees from coming in. So that's interesting. Same thing with coral reefs. Coral reefs are considered a climax community as well. So to create a climax community, though, you often need hundreds, if not thousands, of years of ecological processes taking place. And here's an example of disturbance of succession. So remember, we're starting out simple here with these annual weeds and grasses, which give way to more complex grasses and shrubs, and then lowland trees, and then eventually to hardwood large trees. But that you can actually revert from any one of these back to an earlier state just by disturbing it in some way, whether it be by a fire, which can be natural, or by man-made reasons. So disturbing an area here is like driving an ATV through the desert and disturbing it so that it can no longer, or so that it cannot reach that climax state. Now, what about this level of disturbance? Well, we're going to be getting back into this probably in a few lectures, but you will begin to understand that ecological processes can very easily be disturbed by man-made reasons as well. And so this here is a strip mine where they are literally blowing the tops of these mountains off just to get the minerals and other resources out of them. And here's another one, just another shot of a strip mine in the Appalachians. It's a very, very destructive way of obtaining resources, and the time required to recover from this can be quite extensive. Keep in mind, these mountains right here, the Appalachian Mountains, have been around for 250 million years. 250 million years, just a matter of months to destroy it. Okay, well, what about diversity? Diversity, it turns out, the more diverse a system is, the more stable it tends to be. And you're going to see that actually when we talk about food webs and food chains in a few slides. But the higher the diversity, the more stable the system is. Well, how do you maintain that high degree of diversity? Turns out that disturbance can actually play a role in maintaining a high degree of diversity. If you have a situation, or if you have a habitat where there's very little disturbance. It's calm, it's quiet, the temperature doesn't change very much. Actually, those kinds of communities end up being dominated by a few individuals that are very good at outcompeting everybody else. However, on the other extreme, if you have a habitat that has a huge amount of disturbance, like waves crashing along the shore, making it really hard to survive in those areas, only a few individuals are going to be able to survive in that area. So high disturbance, it ends up excluding those slow growers. But if there's a very low amount of disturbance, it allows dominant species to end up excluding others. And so in both of those situations, high disturbance and low disturbance, you end up with a low diversity of animals. It is in the intermediate or medium disturbance case that you have enough disturbance to to prevent the dominant species from taking over, but the disturbances are not so frequent that slow growers can't come in and at least get a foothold. So this curve right here, and actually this one over here too, these are just two ways of viewing the same thing, both of them are curves that illustrate the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Intermediate disturbance is actually where you get the greatest amount of diversity. An occasional fire actually helps maintain diversity in a forest. An occasional hurricane might actually help maintain the diversity on a coral reef. You don't want to have a whole lot of hurricanes, or you don't want to have a huge number of fires, but actually having no fires and no hurricanes actually produces a low amount of diversity too. There just isn't enough disturbance at that point. So intermediate disturbance is really important. Now, how else do animals interact? How do organisms interact? They live in a vacuum? Well, of course not. Species end up competing with each other or interacting by eating each other, or in some cases, they might actually either hurt or help each other. And so I've broken down these interactions into three main categories. The first one here is competition, where organisms are actually competing for resources, whether it be space, whether it be homes, whether it be food, or anything like that. That's competition between species. In fact, this picture here is showing you two corals that are competing for space, and this is actually like a battle zone right here, where they're actually stinging each other to death to try and accumulate more space. A second way for them to interact is for there to be a predator and a prey. Clearly, a predator must eat prey, and a prey is going to do everything it can to prevent the predator from eating it. So this is a co-evolutionary event that has been going on for a very long period of time between many predators and prey. Another way for species to interact is through symbiosis. And symbiosis is a very generic term. It does not mean good, bad, or indifferent. It simply means two organisms that are interacting in an intimate way. And we're going to break down symbiosis a little bit further in a little bit. But let's first start with competition, then we'll come back to predation, and then symbiosis. Okay, competition. There are a couple of different ways that competition can occur. The first variety here is interspecific competition. Inter means that it's between members of different species. So for example, see all these birds here? They're all different species of birds. There's at least 5 different species here. And they're all competing for space, and potentially even worms and little critters that might be living in the mud and the sediment here. So all these birds are competing with each other for resources. That is an example of interspecific competition. But there's also another kind of competition, intraspecific. Intraspecific competition is between members of the same species. So for example, multiple species or multiple members of the human species that might be competing for space or for food. Okay, so here's another example. Here's rams that are competing with each other for access to females. So that's intra-specific competition. And which one's more intense? Well, the answer is the one that's more intense is intra-specific. It's more intense because these guys over here, these bird species, all different species, their gene frequencies are going to be changing in response to each other. And their genes are going to end up changing in a way that minimizes the amount of competition. It's much easier when the species are actually different. When, however, the members that are competing are of the same species, that is, they have the same genetic complement for the most part, it's much harder to evolve away from each other to minimize that competition. In fact, competition ends up producing the strongest members of a population that are going to have a greater chance of passing on their genes into the future. So competition is actually very well studied. This is a classic case of competition, Gauss's classic paramecium study. We have 3 different species of paramecium. We have Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum, and then another one that I'm going to show you in just a second, Paramecium bursaria. And this first one here, Paramecium aurelia, they tend to grow kind of like this S-shaped curve, right? Like that logistic growth model that we spoke about the last time. And this is in a petri dish. But so does Paramecium caudatum. It also grows in a logistic fashion. However, when you put these two together, look what happens. They both start growing exponentially, but as soon as they start approaching that carrying capacity and they start leveling off to a more logistic growth model, one actually ends up outcompeting the other. And after 24 to 26 days, if you look in that petri dish, you're actually down to only one of the species. They have actually outcompeted each other at this point. So one is a superior competitor to the other. Now, in this case, we're not going to show it here, but this third species imparts another complexity to this. It actually figures out how to survive in the presence of either one of these other two. These guys end up growing, competing with it, but because these green guys end up living in a slightly different area of the petri dish, they prefer to be down below, while these guys prefer to be down up above in the water column. They tend not to compete with each other. And so by minimizing that competition, they both end up surviving. But these two, their niche, their overlap is so close that they end up directly competing and butting heads with each other until eventually one is driven to extinction. Another example of this occurring, here is a species or two species of birds. And this is actually another classic case. Here you have this one species up here that is living on Los Hermanos Islet. And if you were to measure the depth of their beak, so the depth of their beak is like from the bottom of one beak to the top of the other, this depth right here. If you were to measure that, there would be a variation in this particular species that kind of centers around this size right here. Okay. On a different island, Daphne Major Island, this species right here also has a range in beak depth. It ranges like this. But take a look, they both tend to overlap, but they don't encounter each other on these islands, so it's not a big deal. However, on San Cristobal Island and Florinia Island, both of these species are present. Where they tend to be present together, notice what happens to the beak depth. In this case, the members of this side of the gene frequency end up getting selected for, and the beak depth gets smaller. And in this species here, the beak depth gets bigger as members from this side of the gene frequency get favored. Now, why would there be this shift? Because having different beak sizes means that you can eat different food. So by having different beak sizes between the two of them, they compete less. So by competing less, they're more successful. So this sort of exclusion is actually very important, and it does happen. You see this shift in gene frequencies as a result of being put in the presence of another species. Okay, so that's competition. What about predation? Well, predation is ubiquitous. It happens everywhere, right? There's always predators, and predators are very important members of an ecosystem. Number one, they feed directly on other members of a prey that might be weak or less fit. So it ends up actually enhancing the fitness of the very prey population on which they are eating or which they're surviving. It ends up reducing competition between members of prey. So if you have two prey items that are competing for the grasses in an area, but you have a predator out there kind of controlling both of those populations of prey, then the prey populations, are going to compete less. It also prevents population overgrowth, and it ends up stimulating natural selection to make sure that herds remain healthy. Okay, let's also talk about interactions now, the symbiosis issue. I had mentioned that I was going to specify different kinds of symbiosis. Remember, symbiosis is neither positive, it's not negative, it's not indifferent. It's simply an intimate way that two organisms can interact with each other. So these three here are the three varieties of symbiosis. We have commensalism. In commensalism, one of the species in the interaction actually benefits from that interaction, but the other one is completely unaffected. It could care less. Mutualism is the one that most people think about when they think of symbiosis. That's where both members of the species, or I should say both species, benefit from the interaction. Parasitism is where one species benefits at the expense of the other. So one gets a real positive effect, the other gets a real negative effect. So these are the three different variants of symbiosis. And if you were to kind of spell it out, it would look kind of like this. Commensalism is a plus zero. Mutualism is a plus plus, where both benefit. And parasitism is a plus minus. Okay, so these are the potential outcomes of these three interactions. And I want to go through and kind of show you a couple of really good examples of this. The classic case for commensalism would be this right here. Commensalism of cattle and cattle egret. Here's an egret down here, and he's walking around underneath this cattle, and the cattle is down there eating the grass, grazing on the grass, and he eats the grass, and in so doing ends up stirring up all of the insects that might be in and around the grasses there. So the egret comes in and is able to feed more effectively by the cow doing its thing on all of the insects that are popping up. However, the egret doesn't do anything in return for the cattle. The cattle could care less. So it's a good example of commensalism. And another good example is the anemone and the clownfish here. A lot of people still consider the clownfish and the anemone to be a good example of mutualism. But it turns out, because of new information that's coming out, it's not really a mutualistic relationship. In fact, it's more commensal. In this case, the fish is benefiting by the protection that these stinging cells on the anemone provide. So these guys dart into there, and a predator's not going to follow them, because otherwise they're going to get a face full of stinging tentacles. The fish doesn't really do much, though, for the anemone. And in fact, the only reason the fish is not eaten by this anemone is because they're able to rub the mucus from these anemones all over their body, and the anemone doesn't recognize the fish as being different. It detects it and thinks that it's looking at itself. If you took one of these fish and you were actually to keep it away from an anemone for like a couple of months and allow the anemone slime to wash off of these fish, and then take him and throw him back in with the anemone, trust me, as soon as he darts into that anemone, the anemone will have no problem eating that fish. Okay, mutualism, again, the one that most people think about, but actually it's the most uncommon of the different varieties of symbiosis. This is where both are benefiting. And people would think, well, that's really great. They're getting along. They're working together. That is not true at all. That's not the proper way to view mutualism. In the case of mutualism, both of these organisms are behaving selfishly. It's just that in the act of being selfish, the other species gets to benefit too. For example, you're looking here at a green sea turtle with algae growing on its back. Well, green sea turtles need to be, real streamlined and slick in swimming through the water so that they can escape from potential predators. Having a big mat of algae on your back actually slows you down. It creates drag in the water. So it's to a turtle's benefit to have these fish come over and actually pick the algae off its back and start eating all the algae. Well, this turtle is by no means doing this because it likes the fish. It's simply allowing the fish to take advantage of the fact that there's an algae meal on its back. These fish, on the other hand, are providing a service. They're not doing this because they love that turtle. They're doing it because it's an algae meal that they can't find anywhere else on the reef. So the fish is going after the algae. The turtle is allowing them to do so. Both are benefiting, even though they're not doing it specifically for the other species. They're doing it for themselves. So the last variety is by far the most common variety of symbiosis, parasitism. Parasitism is the most common symbiosis. It is where one species benefits at the expense of the other. And I have two really good examples down here of a little isopod. Okay, these are basically your roly-poly bugs, right? They're related to your roly-polies. And these guys are living on the face and the heads of these poor fish, and they're sucking the juices right out of this poor animal. And, well, it's a fish. It doesn't have hands to pull these animals off, so it has to just basically swim around and accept the fact that it's got a parasite on it. And this particular crab up here actually has a parasite living in its body, We're not going to go over the details of this, but the parasite that's living in the body of this crab actually hijacks its reproductive structure down here. You would think, oh, hey, look at this crab. It must be pregnant. Those must be baby eggs from the crab. Nope, that's not it at all. This is actually the reproductive structure of the parasite that is living inside of the crab. It has literally hijacked the reproductive structure of the crab. Pretty dastardly, don't you think? But because symbiosis, and parasitism in particular, is so intimate, these organisms are in direct contact with each other, that there's a lot of coevolution going on here. You have species that are actually responding to their potential host, evolving to become a better parasite, at the same time that prey or the hosts are evolving to try and thwart the parasite to prevent it from doing its thing. This is a classic case of coevolution here. This poor fish actually has this device right here. Notice it looks a little bit like a tongue. That's not a tongue. That's actually an isopod parasite living where a tongue used to be on this fish. It settles as a little tiny larvae, and it settles in the mouth, and it begins to gnaw on the tongue of this fish, and it eventually eats it as the animal grows. It then begins to suck blood out of the stump that used to be the tongue. Okay? Well, not to be undone, obviously this fish has to eat, right? So anytime the fish is swimming around with its, parasite for a tongue, um, it swallows its prey fish and it closes its mouth to swallow. And an interesting behavior actually emerges from this parasitic isopod in the mouth. It actually pushes up with its legs so that its back hits the roof of the mouth of the fish, so it actually helps the fish swallow. Even though it has eaten the tongue away from this fish, it behaves like the tongue of the fish to help that fish feed. This is kind of what it looks like in cross section. I know it's kind of gruesome, but if you carve away the side of this fish's face, you'll see the isopod parasites sitting there right on what used to be the tongue. Isn't that amazing? Okay, predator-prey interactions. Obviously, if you're a prey and you're an animal, you're going to get up and try and run away when a predator comes after you. But if you are a plant, you don't have that luxury. You're anchored to the ground or some other substrate. You can't get up and run away. So plants have evolved all kinds of really interesting chemicals, secondary compounds, strange poisons and oils and pharmaceuticals even, to prevent animals from consuming them. However, some of the herbivores that eat these plants have co-evolved to be able to thwart the plant's defense. So in some cases, they actually take on the poisons that the plant produces and use them for their own means. But at least in most cases, plants are the winners. And so here's a great example, actually, of using a plant's poisons for another end. In this case, we're talking about the monarch butterfly. See this monarch right here? Well, monarchs, when they are caterpillars, they eat milkweed and a few other things. And they are not affected by the milkweed. They're actually able to consume it without being killed by it, while other animals might be killed by it. So when monarchs emerge as an adult butterfly and go flying around, they are loaded with these chemicals called cardiac glycosides that they get from the milkweed. And if this bird, like this jay right over here, were to grab one and eat it, the first thing it does is throws up. It completely vomits up this monarch. Well, if you're throwing up a monarch and it tastes really bad, this is a really good learning lesson for this bird. Don't eat monarchs. So it ends up being a really good evolutionary adaptation for the monarch. Now, in other animals, they advertise how poisonous they are. These are two examples of poisonous dart frogs where they actually have some incredibly toxic alkaloids. They are so toxic that if the toxin on the outside of the skin of these poisonous dart frogs were to accidentally get in your mouth, some of these species could actually kill you within a matter of 20 minutes. But you wouldn't have to make the mistake of grabbing one of these on a forest floor and eating them. If you saw this color pattern, hopefully you would know, or subconsciously, you need to stay away from this guy. Stay away from anything that is brightly colored in nature. If you're considering eating it, they will probably kill you. Another way to use color patterns would be, in this case, this here is a walking stick. Look at that. Isn't that cool? These guys do the opposite of what those poisonous dart frogs did. The poisonous dart frogs were exhibiting a warning coloration. Warning coloration, like in that last picture, is called aposomaticism, or being aposomatic. If you see something that's brightly colored, again, don't eat it. You're probably going to kill yourself. Versus these kinds of animals. These kinds of animals are cryptic. They're blending in with camouflage with the environment. They're putting all their energy into hiding from potential predators instead of warning potential predators that they're poisonous. So these kinds of animals, cryptic coloration or camouflaged animals, are generally, not always, but usually they're non-poisonous. And these animals also don't tend to live in groups. They tend to be solitary. Okay, so if this walking stick here is a good example of cryptic coloration, and we just saw the poisonous dart frogs as another good example of a terrestrial aposomatic coloration pattern, these guys are actually a really good example of marine aposomatic coloration. These are nudibranchs. Nudibranchs are shellless snails, and they eat all kinds of noxious and toxic things in the ocean, sequester those toxins into their bodies, and then are themselves poisonous to potential predators. So if you see anything brightly colored like this, do not eat them. It will probably hurt you. Now, predators can also do some amazing things too, though. These are all insects that are mimicking a background to hide from their prey. So when a prey goes walking by, they don't notice them, and the predator is able to attack them. Here you have some homopterans, or little plant bugs that look like rose thorns. These three images right here are different kinds of praying mantids that are resembling their background. Like here is the forest floor, this one is resembling a leaf, and this one's resembling an orchid flower. And then here's a green one that my little vertebrate, my daughter, is holding on to there. That was our pet that we had for about 3 months. Her name was Blossom. Just thought I'd let you know that. Okay, so mimicking your background is really cool. But what about mimicking another animal that might be poisonous or toxic? That might work too, even if you're not poisonous or toxic. Maybe there's a value in at least looking like something else that's toxic. So you can capitalize on the defense strategy of something else. And there's actually two different varieties of mimicry. We have what's called Mullerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry. In Mullerian mimicry, these are actually a little less common variety of mimicry. This is where things that are poisonous or have stingers or have ways of defending themselves end up all looking alike to help enforce that recognition, that memory recognition in their potential predators. Here's a good example. This is Mullerian mimicry. You have a yellow jacket, you have two wasps, a hornet and a wasp, and bees. Notice they all have the same color pattern. Every one of these can sting you. But actually, it's better for them to all have this same pattern and resemble each other so that there are fewer mistakes. I mean, you think about it, an animal that tries to eat this guy over here is going to get a mouthful of stinger, but he might end up damaging and killing this animal in the process. It's just better for a potential predator to only have to learn that lesson once. Now, it doesn't know which is which. It just knows that I really should be staying away from this pattern. Okay, all are poisonous, and they're all basically enhancing that predator response in their potential predators by all resembling each other. So that's Mullerian mimicry. In contrast to Batesian mimicry. In Batesian mimicry, other animals that are not toxic and are not poisonous and cannot defend themselves end up taking on or resemble, the look or at least resemble something that is toxic, poisonous, or can defend itself. So here's that wasp again. Obviously, you want to stay away from the wasp, but what has evolved in other insects is a similar kind of look. Isn't this amazing? I'll give you a hint right now. None of these things are wasps, or bees, or hornets, or yellow jackets. These are different kinds of insects that are completely harmless, but they've all taken on a wasp-like look. And I'll give you a second. You can pause here to try and guess what kinds of insects these are. And here are the answers. That's right, this guy up here, it's a fly, not a wasp. This is a beetle, this is a moth, this is also another fly. Here's a moth and another beetle. These are all Batesian mimics of a wasp. Pretty neat. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about the distribution of organisms across space and time, niches, and also what it means to define a habitat. Why do species live where they do? What are the controlling mechanisms that help determine that? Okay, so let's go ahead and define a few things. Let's define what an ecological niche is and what habitats are. A habitat is simply where a species lives, and its ecological niche, that is an organism's ecological niche, is its community role in its habitat, like its job. What does it do? What is its role in the niche, in the habitat? And this is a very specialized niche. This happens to be a seahorse, and there's its head right there, eye, mouth, here's its body, and it's living on a coral. So its habitat is coral reef. Its niche is that it's a zooplankton predator. So it actually is able to hide from potential predators that might eat it, but it's also cryptic and is able to eat little tiny crustaceans and other things that are cruising by it. Okay, so that's its ecological niche. And within its ecological niche, certain animals can specialize in what they do. And niche specialization actually helps keep the system nice and diverse and stable. So it means that by having slightly different niches, for example, these 5 bird species, even though they're competing for space and competing for food, because they eat slightly different things, they're able to survive and coexist. So so all these animals here are eating little invertebrates that are living in the mud, okay? But the kinds of invertebrates that this flamingo eats versus this dabbling duck and this avocet here are slightly different. Look at their beaks. Their beaks are slightly different, which means they're penetrating the mud differently. They are eating on the surface of the mud, or in this case, the avocet is actually penetrating its beak right into the mud and trying to pull little critters out. So because of this, they're able to live in the same mudflat, the same marsh, without impacting each other because they have slightly different niches. In that same vein, ecological niches can be very broad or they can be very narrow. And we generally consider broad niches to pertain to generalist organisms, like this rat right here. Rats are generalist organisms. So are crabs. Crabs are generalist organisms in the ocean. But that is, they can eat pretty much anything. But these kinds of animals, like this panda and like this nudibranch here, they tend to be very much specialists. They eat only one, or two at the most, usually only one different variety of food. That's very different from a rat that can eat hundreds of different things. So the rat is a generalist, this panda is a specialist. It has a very narrow niche in what it can eat. How do these guys specialize over time? Well, over evolutionary time, organisms are going to either evolve to be able to consume many things, or they're going to evolve to be very good at eating one thing. Koala bears, for example, they are very good at eating eucalyptus leaves. I want to come back to this issue of resource partitioning now. Keep in mind that in order for organisms to exist in a very confined area, they have to kind of partition their resources. They have to specialize their niche a little bit so that they don't overlap too much. If they overlap too much, then they have the potential of competing to the point where one gets driven to extinction, if not both. Well, one of the classic examples of resource partitioning and niche specialization is actually in the warbler species of the East Coast. And what you're looking at here are 5 species of warblers. And it doesn't matter what they are here, but these 5 species of warblers all live in the same tree, the same species of tree. And to the untrained eye, if you were to walk through that forest and just kind of look around, you'd be like, wow, there's a lot of warblers. How is it possible that they're all feeding in the same tree on insects that are either crawling around or flying around the tree without outcompeting each other? And it took a researcher by the name of MacArthur to figure this out. He sat in the trees with his binoculars and paid extra special attention to what these warblers were actually doing. And it turns out that where they exist in the tree is slightly different. It helps them reduce the overlap. You have birds, for example, this Blackburnian warbler, and these guys only live on the outer margins or the outer rim of the trees. They never penetrate into the trees. Whereas the black-throated green warbler will exist only in the mid-level of the trees, but they also penetrate in. The Cape May warbler lives at the top of the tree, and the bay-breasted warbler lives just beneath that, but they live more kind of inside the tree than they do on the outskirts, which is different from this black-throated green warbler. And the yellow-rumped warbler, these guys are only at the base of the tree right here. Okay, and they're eating slightly different insects too. Some are eating insects that are crawling on the bark, others are eating insects that are on the branches and the leaves, and still others are eating the insects that are flying on the outside perimeter of the tree. So in so doing, this resource partitioning allows these 5 species to exist simultaneously. Okay, another thing that actually helps to maintain biodiversity are certain key species. Every now and then you get a nice diversity of species, like what you're looking at here. This is an intertidal zone where you've got mussels and barnacles up here, you've got sea stars and a whole bunch of algae down here too. Certain species end up having a disproportionate effect on the overall diversity of the system. Without them there, the system actually can collapse. And these species that have a disproportionate impact, we know them as keystone species. And I'm going to now talk about sea stars as a keystone species. Turns out that if you remove all these sea stars, then the mussels and barnacles up here begin to take over and actually will displace all of these algae down here. And after only a few years, this entire thing would look like one gigantic mussel field. But because you have these sea stars in there, the sea stars actually eat mussels. They love mussels. They eat them like popcorn. But in so doing, they keep this area clear and free of mussels and hence also barnacles. And it gives the algae an opportunity to come in and settle. So in this case, the sea stars are a keystone species. They actually improve the biodiversity of the area just by being present and doing what it is that they do. Another good example of a keystone species, one that exerts a very strong influence on the biodiversity of a community, would be the sea otters. Sea otters eat sea urchins. And by keeping sea urchin densities low, the sea otters actually allow for much more biodiversity of other things on offshore reefs in California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. When sea otters are not present and there aren't predators on those urchins, then it allows the urchin populations to explode. There's nothing controlling them. Well, when urchin populations explode, they end up mowing down entire kelp forests. They will eat all of the kelp until eventually there's no more kelp. They end up starving and dying, and the whole system ends up collapsing. So it's interesting that, and by the way, I should also mention kelp. Having this 3-dimensional structure out there in the water actually enhances biodiversity by attracting other organisms to the kelp bed. When you don't have otters, that whole system collapses. So since the otter disproportionately has an impact on the overall biodiversity of the system by making the diversity higher when they're present, they are known as a keystone species. And here's sea otters. Yeah, they're pretty cute. But make no mistake, if you ever see one out in the wild, don't go up and pet it because they will rip your face off. They are somewhat aggressive, and they can be pretty harmful if you handle them. So just give them a lot of space. But here's a really good example of where this will take an effect. Um, there happens to be a couple of islands in Alaska. There's the Amchatka Islands and the Shemya Islands. On the Amchatka Islands, there happens to be a very dense population of otters. Where there's this dense population of otters, very low urchin densities, and therefore heavy kelp coverage. There's lots and lots of kelp. Okay, with lots and lots of kelp, that also means a lot of three-dimensional structure, and so lots of animals come in. Whereas at Shemya Island, the otters are no longer there. They've been removed, overhunted historically, so now there are no more otters. And therefore, there's extremely high urchin density around Shemya Island. And so kelp does not exist in the offshore environment. The only place you find kelp is in the lower intertidal where the waves are crashing. And that's because the urchins can't get up that high. So where there are lots of otters, there happens to be a high diversity because there's a lot of kelp and all the things that kelp attracts. Where there are no otters, the kelp is only confined to those very few areas where urchins can't get to, and the overall diversity tends to be lower. Now I want to switch directions a little bit. We're going to talk about the difference between native versus exotic species. Native species tend to be those animals, plants, and other organisms that are indigenous to an area. That is, they are found in the area naturally. This red fox is a good example of something that would be indigenous to Europe. Um, in contrast, we have invasive species, which are also known as exotic species. These are animals that are introduced to an area that they are not native to. And in so doing, they end up displacing native species. Sometimes, like this brown tree snake here, they can end up eating native birds or native rodents or small animals, and that ends up changing the balance of the ecosystem dramatically. Um, Also, another thing to consider is that invasive species have not evolved with all of the other animals in the habitat in which they're introduced, and they end up having a disproportionate negative impact on the environment. So when we get to our environmental discussion, the last lecture of this class, we're going to come back to invasive species. Okay, so now what we're going to do is switch directions. We're going to talk about ecosystem structure and function. And this is where we're going to end this lecture, and we're going to start the next lecture up with ecosystem structure and function and start talking about energetics and cycling of nutrients throughout the system. So I will see you all in cyberspace.